We certainly hope that you're feeling settled in, all things considered. Margaret Smith did her best to sound as wistful as possible while sipping on her chicory coffee. In blissful rapture, she seemed to take one sip after another, almost hoping for an inquiry. As one would expect, the statement was bait. Diane made eye contact with Karen, who shook her head not to take it, and try as she might, the seed was planted, and Diane was curious. She figured if Margaret had gone through the trouble of aggressively pursuing neighborly friendship with her, she could stand to listen to a few tales of juicy gossip. She'd finally been cornered into brunch and books, Margaret had called it, as she'd eyed the thick spine of Diane's book yesterday. Unsurprisingly, there wasn't a single book nestled next to Margaret upon her arrival. A shock. The bountiful spread of delightful scones had convinced Diane to sit. She was glad to meet a normal neighbor in Karen, whose shy, soft-spoken ways by far appealed to her. She nibbled on a scone while eyeing the last apple turnover, better to get Margaret talking if she wanted it to. All things considered? The inquiring tone was all it took. Margaret just needed a little push, and she about lit up. A gleam of secrecy sparkled in her eyes, and a sly smile stretched across her face. Well, I assumed that you knew. Realtors really should disclose that information. Quite a bit of history the house you moved into has. Thankfully, nothing as severe as the home next to you. That one's never going to sell, and I'm sure of it. Margaret took a moment to sip more coffee and eye the puff pastries. Diane grabbed the last apple turnover and was rewarded with a brief pout. "These are delicious," she complimented slyly. Margaret glowed at the compliment, and her pout disappeared. "It's my mother's recipe." "Well, anyway, did the realtor say anything about your home?" Diane snapped into focus and frowned thoughtfully. She said the previous sellers wanted to get rid of it after their son went missing. That's hardly the whole shebang, but missing, I suppose, covers it for your lot of property. Diane really was getting tired of the suspense. Regardless of her reluctance before, she was now brimming with anxious curiosity and didn't like things being doled out in small pieces. "Look," she started. Karen's quiet voice came in unexpectedly.
Benson's boy went missing on your property, but his body was found next door. Real estate agents have to disclose things like death on the property. Tricky thing is, he died elsewhere.
Diane was locked in now. She knew there was something about the way the agent glossed over the question, answering the bare minimum. Margaret had the gall to glare at Karen in resentment, apparently. Karen noticed and she flushed at the glare. Nonetheless, she continued speaking.
That's why your agent didn't say much. The company has all but given up on the old Wilson property next door. It's so grisly what happened to that poor boy.
Her voice then had taken on a hoarse quality, denoting she was clearly on the verge of tears. Margaret, for all her sourness over being usurped as the primary storyteller, was quick to comfort Karen. She handed her a napkin. Margaret did then continue. "Well, I suppose after Miss Wilson passed, that's when it really started. Though after it all unraveled, we were all very suspicious about her demise as well. Old Mr. Wilson simply shut himself away. It was just him and Becca, the adorable Sheltie that he and Mrs. Wilson adopted together. I mean, we always caught glimpses of the dog in the window or with him. So we made peace with him not being truly alone. I always pay attention to detail, so I assure you, he only took that dog out in the evening to do its business in the lawn and then back in. That's hardly a life for a dog. Poor thing, I thought. Then he really started to get back into the swing of things. He went to the park twice a week, Saturdays and Sundays, to feed the ducks. That dog was always in a bush, nose in a bush, or in a window facing away, or just far enough away that we would never have known. We know what? Diane asked, her mind exploding at the potential possibilities. Well, Chrisette Jenkins down the road told her mother that while Wilson had a 2-hand grip on the leash because Becca buried half her torso in that bush again, he said to the kids on the playground that he had brought treats for them, excited at the thought of sweets and seeing a beloved and familiar face. Of course they ran over. Of course we warn our children of the strangers, but not the neighbors. Of course they happily went digging around in his pockets. Poor little angels. Shrieks of joy over starbursts and Jolly Ranchers made their squeals of happiness louder. Christette thought it odd that for all the gripping that Wilson did on the leash, Becca did not do a whole lot of tugging. She remarked to her mother and the police later, he just wanted us rooting around in his pockets, and I couldn't understand why. She would later on say it to Officer Moore, not but 2 weeks later down at the station, and the officer's grimace would be lost on her. He didn't much mind Chrisette's lack of interest. It was when she offered to hang on to Becca's leash for him so he could distribute the candy that things got odder still. He stiffened up like a dog, she said, and he said it was fine, but he had to hold on to Becca as she was not feeling too well. And then he left after carrying Becca out of there in a hurry, her stiff little legs sticking out at odd angles. He never really went to the park after that, just spent time walking Becca at odd hours around the property. She was always in the bushes on the property line, rooting around in more bushes it seemed. Then he would carry her in. He got pretty close to the Bensons next door. Dennis, their son, was allergic to animals, but he loved that dog, and he would ask old Wilson lots of questions. The Bensons later told the Officer Moore, they would use Wilson as a secondary adult, one for reference if the babysitter needed anything, and she never really did, but she did have a lot to say about Wilson later on too. She did note that whenever she ordered pizza, she would see him out in the middle of the night letting Becca piddle. She said something about his shape slowly coming into view, just barely, in the shadow of the porch light always spooked her. She didn't really understand the dog always needing to piddle on the property line, in the bushes, in the same spot, and she said it was always strange that he would just stand there in the dark for 40 minutes swaying like a rickety old bridge and then go back in. She watched him once, shielded by the curtains, very steely tall, swaying in the dry breeze, the only thing in that yard that was moving, going back and forth. Becca was firmly embedded in the bushes, unmoving, potentially digging or sniffing, but she wasn't doing a whole lot of moving. She did remark later, the babysitter, that the dog was ultimately the most quiet of dogs. She never heard it make a sound. No one had until Dennis had gone missing, that is. Margaret paused again and let out another sigh. We organized a neighborhood watch. We went patrolling and we collaborated with officers, but it did nothing. Diane chimed in. So he took him then? Wilson? Her eyebrows raised questioningly. Yes, Margaret said. Friday, October 5th, 8 p.m. Jason Stent dropped off a medium-sized pepperoni at 8:05, and at 8:08 he watched the girl he delivered it to run outside and scream, "Dennis!" like a wild banshee before she ran at the car screaming if he saw anything. Saw a boy asking him to call the police, saying there was so much blood that she didn't know what to do, and then she ran back into the house to the phone. 2 calls were made. One was to 911 and then one to his parents. If you had hit the Bensons with the bus and backed up again, the Bensons would not have appeared quite as shell-shocked as they did for the next month. Wilson was hardly a blip. He kept to the same routine. We were all scrambling, keeping insane tabs on our kids. He expressed his condolences and he even brought them a casserole. He always took Becca for her walks to piddle in the bushes. He took her less and less, but we hardly noticed. What we did notice was Becca was noisy. She was noisier. She'd taken to nightly howling and seemed inconsolable in the evenings whenever he took her out to use the bathroom. Bertha Stewart, on the other end of him, him simply thought the old girl was going through some sort of pain and maybe needed to be let go of finally. Of course, she talked to him. She'd gone over to his yard, and on the way she crossed through the yard, and in her old age she was keen on shorter walks than to everything. So she crossed through the grass, and she noted that it could use some watering, that it was dry, and that there were these odd splotches, darker looking earth by the bushes, dark brown and odd maroon colors. She got close enough that she did not even notice stepping in one, but the sickly scent was a soft musk of oddities that she could not quite begin to comprehend what it could be. Wilson came out and quickly called to her, and she'd forgotten all about it. Saying hello to her neighbor, she expressed her concerns about old Becca, but he was steadfast, saying that she was all that he had left now. And as Bertha would tell you, she cannot see worth a lick, but she can hear like a bat. And as he was going on and on about Becca being the last thing that he had, she could hear Becca howling up a storm inside, and it did not sit right with her. November 6, 5 p.m., Bertha Stewart tracked blood through her house. Once Bertha retraced her steps, she realized the darker earth around the Wilson property had been puddled with blood. There were too many puddles, and though she remarked to Officer Moore later that she was heavy-hearted to have called the ASPCA, she felt so bad for poor old Becca. When the ASPCA arrived, that is truly when the shit hit the fan. They asked to see the dog, and after they too noted too many bloody puddles and Mr. Wilson refused to let them in, they called the police, and they forced their way in, and what they found left many of us stunned.
Hi guys, we really hope that you enjoyed part 1 of this original tale. If you liked our story or you found plot points interesting, please feel free to comment below. We'd like to discuss. If you would like to submit your own story, don't be afraid to reach out. You can expect that there will be links below to our Instagram page, and you can use either one to submit your story. As always, we appreciate the support, and we hope you're having a wonderful day. Thank you.